Good evening and welcome. My name is Paige Berger, and I am the marketing director here at Barrett Bookstore. On behalf of the entire Barrett Bookstore staff and our behind-the-scenes event coordinator, Rosanna Nissen, and our friends at the Darien Community Association, thank you for joining us this evening. I will introduce our distinguished guests, Walter Isaacson and Wendy Kopp, in a moment, but first, a few housekeeping notes. For those of you who aren't familiar with Barrett Bookstore, we are located in Darien, Connecticut, and we are in our 81st year of business. Thank you to our community who has helped us stick around through this past eventful year, and we hope to be here for many years to come. We're really thrilled to be here tonight with the Darien Community Association, one of our treasured bookstore partners and a foundational organization here in town. Many thanks to Executive Director Amy Bell, the board, and the staff for their tireless work in promoting and helping us organize tonight's event, which is one of many we've partnered on over the past handful of years. We deeply appreciate our partnership with the DCA. Now, for those of you who haven't used Crowdcast before, it is a webinar platform. That means we can't see you, so feel free to pour yourself a drink and put your feet up. There will be time for question and answer toward the end of the program. So if you have a question at any point while Walter and Wendy are having their conversation, you can pop your question in the Ask a Question button right there at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many as we can as time allows. And now the reason we're here to introduce our guests. Walter Isaacson is a professor of history at Tulane University and the author of this brilliant new book, The Code Breaker, which all of you received a copy for in exchange for the ticket price. Walter has worn many hats during his long and distinguished career, including serving as the CEO of the Aspen Institute, chair of CNN, and editor of Time. He is the author of several best-selling books, including Leonardo da Vinci, The Innovators, Steve Jobs, Einstein, His Life and Universe, Benjamin Franklin, An American Life, and Kissinger, A Biography. And he's also the co-author of The Wise Men's 6 Friends and the World They Made. If you would like to purchase any of those books, we're happy to hook you up. And we do have a website. Among the myriad of philanthropic and leadership commitments, Walter is chairman emeritus of the Board of Teach for America, who brings us to our next guest. Joining Walter in conversation tonight is Wendy Kopp, CEO and co-founder of Teach for All, a global network of independent organizations that are developing collective leadership to ensure that all children have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. Wendy is also the founder and former CEO of Teach for America, which she founded in 1989 to marshal the energy of her generation against educational inequity in the United States. Today, more than 6,000 Teach for America core members, outstanding recent college graduates, and professionals from all academic disciplines are in the midst of 2-year teaching commitments in over 50 urban and rural regions. And Teach for America has proven to be an unparalleled source of long-term leadership for expanding opportunity for children. Wendy has been recognized as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people and is the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and awards for public service. On a personal note, as an alumni of the national team at Teach for America, it's a true and distinct pleasure to welcome both Walter and Wendy here tonight. It feels a bit like a homecoming for me. I know you are all going to really enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, Walter, Wendy, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Paige. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paige and Walter. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. So you all, as you just heard, I mean, I got to know Walter because of his passion, and he has so many passions. I mean, I truly view you as the modern day Renaissance man, Walter, but his passion for making sure that all kids have access to an excellent education, which led him to chair the board of Teach for America for almost a decade. But I'm really also just grateful to have the chance to do this because it forced me to prioritize reading this incredible and incredibly timely book, which really sparked so much for me personally. In part about the importance of the messages we send our young people, about the importance of science and their potential as scientists. And in fact, I invited my 13-year-old daughter to watch this book talk, and I sent the book to my freshman in college because it just resonated so much. It also sparked a lot about the just many discoveries and all the history behind the vaccines and the COVID tests that are doing so much for the world right now, as well as about the moral dilemmas ahead that are also enabled by these same discoveries. So I'm excited to get into all of this, Walter. There's so much to discuss.
And I'm so excited to be with you. As you know, you're one of my heroes. You have been for so long. And I guess one of the greatest joys of my life was being chair of the board, which meant I got to ride shotgun with you on a pretty noble mission.
Amazing. Well, thank you. So let's start with education, actually. Can you share a bit about what you learned about Jennifer Doudna's kind of education and upbringing that sparked her kind of incredible journey and career?
Well, as you said, you want to leave this book on the bed of either a daughter or a son or niece or nephew. And Jennifer's journey began in Hilo, Hawaii, where she was feeling like a bit of an outsider. She was the tall, lanky blonde, but in a small town where everybody else in the class was Polynesian. And so she was very good in school, but very quiet, read a lot. And so one day she came home from middle school and found that her father had left a paperback on her bed, which he sometimes did. It was called The Double Helix by James Watson. And at first she thought it was a detective story, because she loved those. But when she picked it up on a rainy Saturday, she realized that in a way she was right. It was a journey of adventure and detective story to find the secrets of life. And she noticed in that book a character named Rosalind Franklin, who's treated rather condescendingly by Dr. Watson, calls her Rosie, which she never called herself. But Jennifer told me, I didn't care about that. What I cared about was I realized that women could become scientists. Now, here's something that I know no Teach for America Corps member or alum would do. Her school counselor told her, no, girls don't do science. And yet she persisted. She decided she was going to, instead of major in French or study French, she went to Pomona and did biology and chemistry. And then she was going to come back to Hawaii, maybe go to graduate school. And her father said, why haven't you applied to Harvard? And she said, Dad, I'll never get into Harvard. And he said, yeah, you won't if you don't apply. And she did. She got into Harvard and started studying RNA, which most of the men were focused on DNA. But a group of women, including her and Jillian Banfield and Emmanuel Charpentier, the other heroes in this book, in the early 90s started focusing on RNA. And that's how we get these vaccines. That's how we get gene editing. It's so wonderful.
Yeah, I want to get into that. But one more question before we get there. Like, you have followed and written about some of the most amazing inventors in the world, from Einstein to Steve Jobs to, I think Benjamin Franklin, et cetera. And I just wonder, as you reflect across all of these incredible people, like Jennifer Doudna, like, what you feel like they've had in common and what the implications of that are for our education system.
I think the one thing that they've had in common that's most important was curiosity, pure curiosity not directed at any purpose, but for its own sake, a passionate, playful, sometimes obsessive curiosity. In Leonardo's notebook as a young person, it's describe the tongue of the woodpecker. Well, who would, want, and how would you even do it? Find a way, but he was curious. He was curious about why is the sky blue? And then I realized Einstein wrote that, and so did Jennifer Doudna when she was growing up in Hawaii. And Leonardo was curious about why seashells curled the way they did. Well, that's something that fascinated Jennifer. And so that notion of being curious for its own sake, why is the sky blue type curious, that's something we all had in our wonder years. And sometimes teachers knock it out of us, or grown-ups do, by saying, quit asking so many silly questions. But the thing my heroes had in common was they never outgrew their wonder years. Even now, they're like curious for its own sake, and they discover from that nature is beautiful. And then it also happens that nature is useful. Like if you're very curious about how bacteria have clustered repeated sequences, all of a sudden you realize that's pretty useful if we're going to be in a pandemic.
Yeah. Incredible. I mean, I think it's really worth the nation's and the world's educators reflecting on that and on the implications for all of our work. So, okay, well, just so that the audience here understands the significance of Jennifer Doudna's career, can you say a bit more about, I guess, her discoveries and their importance to this pandemic that we're in right now and to the future of medicine? I mean, I know that's a huge topic, but just to get us into the central.
Absolutely. Storyline. And it's why she was a great central character for the book, because as I said, when she goes to graduate school, she focuses on RNA, the less famous of the molecules, compared to DNA. But it turns out RNA actually does real work, whereas DNA just sits in our nucleus of our cells and curates our genetic code. RNA does a couple of things. It can be a guide that takes an enzyme, like a pair of scissors, and can cut DNA or other things. Secondly, it can be a messenger to the manufacturing regions in our cells to say, build this protein. That's how we get the vaccines now. Build a spike protein, we tell it to do, and boom, we have immunity to the spike protein of the coronavirus. So she focuses on this, and her teacher, this is another lesson, besides encouraging people to just be curious for their own sake and, nurturing that, her advisor at Harvard said, always ask the big question. So she says to him, well, what's the big question here? And he says, how did life begin? How did life begin on this planet? And she discovers how RNA, because of its shape, can replicate itself, can copy itself. And so in the stew of chemicals 4 billion years ago, you get these, 4 pairs of chemicals bouncing together, and soon they start replicating themselves, and we have life on planet Earth. But he also told her that God is in the details. It's not just every little bit of the chemicals, it's how they fold and shape and stuff. So she's able to then go on and look at this system bacteria have called CRISPR. And that's how they fight viruses, by using RNA to target the virus that may be attacking them. And she says, I get it. We can reprogram that RNA to target and cut our own DNA. And so she invents a tool that can edit our DNA. She does it with Emmanuel Charpentier, a French biologist who's a research partner. And then from that, she later goes on to use this tool to make detection technologies for coronavirus over the past year, ways we can fight coronavirus. But most importantly of all, she realizes that there are ethical implications, that if we get to edit the genes of our kids and make them taller, or pick their hair color, or pick their sexual orientation, whatever, this is not a path we want to go too far down. So she gathers scientists from around the world and leads the effort to have, as she's doing now, an international consensus on when do we use this gene editing technology and when do we not.
First of all, you just made that so amazingly understandable. I mean, I say that as the most lay person ever, but thank you for that beautiful explanation. Can you say more about the moral dilemmas and about what you think? What are you now thinking about all these moral dilemmas?
When Jennifer invented this technology with Emmanuel and others, right afterwards she has a nightmare. And it's that somebody wants to learn about how you use this technology to edit our genes. And she goes in the room, the person looks up, and it's Hitler. And that's when she realizes that we have to make sure we don't use this for eugenic purposes, to edit out the diversity of the human species. And so she gathers people, as I said, to say, we should do this to fight diseases. And we should start with easy single gene diseases like sickle cell, Tay-Sachs, Huntington's, cystic fibrosis, and do it in living patients who give their consent. We should try to avoid using it for enhancements. In other words, and there's a blurry line, because if you cure somebody, say, of sickle cell and make their blood carry more oxygen, you can also just go further and they can become a great marathoner. You can make their blood better than typical. But that's where we should stop. We shouldn't do it for enhancements. And then the real line that we probably shouldn't cross, although it's already happened, is editing reproductive cells or early stage embryos. So you're making inheritable edits that don't just affect the patient, but all future generations and the human species. And that happened in China a couple of years ago. And Jennifer's been trying to make sure we don't cross that line again until we know absolutely sure that it's safe.
And did you come away from this exploration with a view on how we're going to, like, what we need to do to make sure we navigate those dilemmas with great care? I mean, it sounds like she's doing it, but what thoughts do you have about how we can take precautions around that?
Well, you said how we are going to do it. And that word is important, we, because it's not just up to the scientists that Jennifer gathers. I think all of us as a society have to say, what do we feel? You and me and everybody listening, because it's going to have to be a social consensus where we decide, all right, we don't shoplift. We don't, sell elephant tusks. We both have regulations, but we shame people. We don't break in line for the coronavirus vaccine. Surprisingly, that became, a moral feeling of our society. Therefore, I wrote this book so we can all be part of the discussion. It's not a whole bunch of science in there, but it does explain what gene editing we can do. And I do step by step through the quarter of the book is about, let's take this case of Huntington's. Okay, now let's figure out sickle cell. What about adding to people's height? What about adding IQ? What about taking out manic depression or schizophrenia or bipolar? Not that we can do all these things now, but if we could, how far down this slope would we go? And of course, it's a slippery slope, but the point of my book is all slopes are slippery. But if you do it step by step, preferably hand in hand with everybody else in society, we can make this easier to navigate. But let me, if you don't mind, add one more thing, because a lot of people say, how do we stop this? Or isn't there some challenge or ethical thing? Let us remember, this is a godsend. This is an ability to cure people of horrible genetic diseases. And Jennifer's feeling on it changed, and so did mine, even after coronavirus hit. It changed for her when every time she gave a speech, people would come up to her and they'd pull out a picture and say, here's my 12-year-old daughter, or here's my 9-year-old son or grandson, and he has this, and she has sickles, or she has cystic fibrosis, and they say he's going to die in 3 years. Can you save me? Save him or her? And ever since I've published this book, it's only been 4 weeks, I get 20 emails a day from people describing the genetic conditions of their kids or grandkids and say, here's a picture, can you put me in touch with Jennifer? So let's not slam on the brakes just because we're afraid that 20, 30 years from now, people will be using this in ways that we may not approve.
Yeah. I'm actually seeing a few questions on this, and I'll just surface a couple of them that the audience are raising. Like, one is, you just referenced the babies that were created with this gene editing tool in China. And the first question is, what happened to the CRISPR babies? And I remember in the book, I think it wasn't a public thing, but do you know what happened to them?
No, they're about almost 2.5 years old, and they're being monitored. They seem to be fine, but we don't know the details of it. China has been good in the sense that this was something unauthorized. So the doctor who did it is now in jail. They was put on trial and in jail. But let's do the thought experiment. What he did to those two, turned out to be twin girls, is he edited out the receptor for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. And that was something you shouldn't do. The regulations were against it. Probably wasn't safe, that sort of thing. But after this year of a global pandemic, if we can edit to some extent safely, we can edit safely to some extent the receptors that cause us to be susceptible to viruses, I'm not against that. What's wrong with that?
Yeah. The next question is basically around, do we know enough? Turning off sickle cell affects malaria protection.
Right.
I guess these are just the moral dilemmas ahead.
Well, they're not really the moral dilemmas; they're the safety dilemmas.
The dilemmas, yeah.
They are dilemmas. And yes, we have to make sure we can do it safely. We've done it with sickle cell. It did it this past year. And yes, there's some extent that the mutation causing sickle cell might help against West Nile virus. But if you're David Sanchez in this book and a 17-year-old in Los Angeles, and you can't play basketball because you're doubling over in pain, you're not worried about the West Nile virus. So we have to be careful. We have to monitor when it happens. But it's safer to do these things when you're making a fix and then having as the result a patient who has a set of genes that's typical of the species that millions and millions of other people have. So we can guard against off-target mutations at some point, off-target edits at some point, and unintended consequences, but we have to be aware of them. At the moment, it's best with these single gene treatments that we're doing for blindness and for cancer, by the way, because there's not a danger there. If you're editing to make sure our immunotherapy can keep fighting the cancer cells that you have, trust me, that's something you want to have happen. There's not unintended consequences.
Yeah, and there's something so exciting in that. So, and you say in the book that you think this era of biotechnology will be the third great scientific revolution. And I wonder if you can say more about kind of how you see that progression and what you think the future of this kind of biotech era could be.
Well, the first half of the 20th century was a revolution based on physics, a lot of which comes from Einstein. And you get everything from, space travel to GPS to atom bombs, semiconductors. And then the second half of the 20th century was basically a digital revolution, which comes from the combination of the microchip, the internet, and the computer, especially the personal computer. And, people like you and me, we made sure, and so did Teach for America, that kids were familiar with coding, that they understood the digital, basics of coding. They didn't have to be master coders, but they had to kind of understand how to understand that language. Well, now I think for the first half of the 21st century, we're going to have kids be trained not only in digital code, but also have a feel for the code of life. What do genes do? I mean, we have to make sure people know what a gene is, what it can do, what happens when you change it. And so I think now we're entering into a life science era that'll be much more consequential than the digital revolution. As much as I love my iPhone and occasionally go on Twitter, that's nothing compared to the ability to defeat cancer, to defeat viruses, to edit out really bad genetic diseases, and the dilemmas that come when we have the power to snatch, like Prometheus, fire from the gods, and edit our children to have certain traits we may want. So that's going to be much more consequential, I think, than the other revolutions.
One of the most interesting things I thought about the book was sort of the kind of competition and cooperation, like the role of those two things in sort of accelerating progress in all this. And I wonder what you came out of all this thinking in terms of like what's healthy and what's not. Like sometimes it seemed like the competition was actually pretty crucial, but sometimes it felt like it was a little bit limiting. And the coronavirus era brought a whole new level of cooperation. Like, I'm just wondering how you ended up viewing all of that.
Yes, it was very competitive. In the book, a large part of the book is the race. After Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel discover how CRISPR can cut DNA, there's a race to say, how do we make it work in human cells? How do we optimize it? And it's a three-way race, and it gets very bitter. There's Feng Zhang at MIT, George Church at Harvard, and Jennifer Doudna and her team out at Berkeley. And they then get into a patent battle that becomes truly poisonous and still is. I do think competition is a good thing. As when I was at Time Magazine, we competed with Newsweek. It caused us to stay up late on Saturday to make sure we got more stuff. Likewise, the competition that Jennifer and Emmanuel were waging against the people in Cambridge, Mass, caused them to stay up late and work weekends until they got things. People said to me, boy, I've read your book. Jennifer's very competitive, isn't she? And I say, yes. Isn't that great? Because sometimes people, when they apply it to a woman, it's supposed to have an edge to it. I think it's wonderful. But I do think that the competition for patents and the fight over the patents began to poison the collaboration and cooperation that also has to be part of science. It's got to be just like every person on this meeting who's in business or anywhere knows I compete some, I cooperate some. I've got, that mix. And I think to some extent patents, to some extent prizes. I mean, Jennifer and Emmanuel finally won the Nobel Prize. When I talked to their rival, Feng Zhang, he said, yes, I'm sad, but in some ways it's a relief. The prize caused us not to share information because we were so competitive. And as you pointed out, when the Cambridge guys and then Jennifer and her team turned their attention to the coronavirus, instead of fighting over patents, they publish everything they do the minute they discover it on open source on the internet and say, we're not asserting intellectual property rights. Anybody can use what we've just discovered to fight the coronavirus. And I think it restored some sense that this isn't just about patents and prizes and publication priority. We're doing this for a noble purpose, to help humanity.
Yeah. I want to return to the substance of all this, and please, to the people in the audience, do type in your questions, and we'll bring you into this. But before we do, I'm so fascinated by Jennifer Doudna and all of the cooperators and competitors, but also by you, Walter. I mean, and how incredibly prolific you are, and how you brought such a complicated topic to be accessible to the world. So I wanted to talk a bit about just the process of that, starting with, why'd you decide to write on Jennifer Doudna? How did that decision come about?
I wanted to do the life sciences. I realized this was going to be a much more consequential revolution than even the digital one. And so I started hanging around labs, talking to people in it. And at the Aspen Institute out in Aspen, where I used to work, Jennifer, I invited her, and she and I went on stage, and we got really drilled down on the ethical issues. This is 7 or 8 years ago. And the more I heard of her story, how she had persisted in the face of a lot of headwinds for being a woman, but also how she had asked the really big questions, but then discovered the answer were in these tiny clues. I said, she's a perfect central character, especially when she started taking on the ethical issues. And, me, one of the things I can do is I can listen to people and get them to talk. And I'm an old-fashioned reporter. I mean, so I spent, weeks on end with your friend Michael Lewis from Princeton. He has a place in Berkeley, grew up here in New Orleans with me. So I'd hang out in his guest house and go to Jennifer's lab every day. But even Feng Zhang, who was the competitor in the book, I went to Kendall Square, Cambridge, and he's a delightful guy. And so I spent the time in his lab and eating legal
Sounds
seafood.
So fascinating.
So it's like I got paid. I mean, this is like, what a planet we live on. I get paid to do these really interesting things.
And how long did you spend on this from start to finish?
I think about 7 or 8 years ago, I was gathering string on the life sciences revolution. But I was also gathering string on Louis Armstrong. I didn't quite know what I was
doing. Do you write this stuff down, or do you mean just in your head? You're just gathering this stuff?
Oh, I keep to be right into the nitty gritty of the process. I have a Word document. In other words, I just use an old-fashioned Microsoft Word, and I put it all in chronological order. And so if I have a great interview or I talk to somebody, I'll say, okay, here's my Jennifer Doudna Microsoft document, and I'll just type up my notes, and then it'll sit there in Dropbox until I say, okay, I need this.
The timing of the publication of this book, though, is a little surreal. That just really, when did you realize this is going to be, I guess when the rest of the world did, in March, this is going to be very timely?
Yeah, last March, Jennifer brought her only child, Andy, to a robot building competition in Fresno, sent them off on the train. And at 2 a.m, Jennifer wakes up her husband and says, all right, we got to go pick up Andy. This thing is spreading and I don't want him to be in a convention. So, Andy being an only child is like rolling his eyes when he gets picked up. But then they get a text message saying, robot competition canceled. Everybody has to go home. And that's when she turned the next day to gathering 50 scientists saying, okay, we're all going to drop what we're doing and turn our attention to this. And that's when I realized, all right, I thought I was 3/4 of the way finished the book. Now I realize I'm only half finished the book. I've got a full year where I'm going to report on how they turn their attention and the tools that they had developed to coronavirus. And luckily in the middle of that, she wins the Nobel Prize. So, there's a beautiful picture in the book of her hugging Andy and her husband, Jamie, in the kitchen right when they get told they win the Nobel Prize. So I kept extending this book. But once we got the vaccines and once she got the Nobel Prize, I said to my editor and I said to Jennifer, all right, this is how the book climaxes.
Yeah, wow. I guess you just answered my next question, which was going to be, what were the most exhilarating moments, but what were the most challenging moments of this journey? Like, were you ever stuck and thought, I don't know how I'm going to pull all this together?
Well, one of the exhilarating moments was also a head-snapping moment, which is I decided, we used to say, you're such a schools person, the slogan of my school here in New Orleans was Discum Sugera Agenda, which means we learn to do by doing. So I said to Jennifer, you got to teach me how to gene edit. I want to edit human genes.
Wow.
And so I went to the Berkeley lab. She gave me 2 graduate students, and I was able to edit human genes. Now, don't worry, we mix them with chlorine and flush them down the drain, and they're not part of the planet. But that was exhilarating because in the test tubes and mixing and looking at them under, these devices that show you if it's glowing or things that have the lines. That was exhilarating, but also frightening to know, oh, wait, I can do this? So this is going to be a gene or genie that's hard to keep in a bottle.
Amazing. And this may be top secret, but what are you working on next? I
don't really know. It's not top secret. And I just took a vacation with Kathy and then with a couple other friends who are writers and my agent. And we kicked it around. The biography of Wendy Kopp, we're not yet at the end of that movie. And I know there are a couple more reels in the movie. You and I are old enough to know what a movie reel is. So I'll have to find somebody else.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, let's turn to audience questions. And I'm seeing a few here, but you all feel free to add more. So how about editing the gene of, say, a mosquito so it doesn't carry the malaria? I think that was in reference to the previous conversations. People are stuck on the malaria thing.
No, it's an incredibly good question. In fact, there are people, you may have read about it in the New Yorker, Michael Spector did a great piece on it, of people at MIT doing gene drives for mosquitoes to make them so they don't carry malaria or other things like that. So not only can you edit mosquitoes for that purpose or edit them so they will die out if you want to get rid of mosquitoes, you can have what's called a gene drive, which speeds it through the entire species. Now, this to me is very frightening. And one of the things Jennifer is doing with a grant from the Defense Department is something called anti-CRISPR. Because, it may be wonderful to edit out mosquitoes that carry malaria, but it's just as easy to edit a super mosquito that does carry a pathogen or some huge disease. And so the Defense Department is looking for ways to combat that.
Wow, that's fascinating. The next question was, how did microbes, bacteria, get so smart protecting against viruses ahead of humans?
That's a wonderful question, and it allows me to geek out for a second on the science, which is cool. Because yes, for 1 billion years, bacteria have been using this trick to fight viruses. And when people say, how can you explain CRISPR? Isn't it complicated? I say, no, if bacteria can do it for 1 billion years, they're not much smarter than most of us. It can't be that hard. And what they do is every time they get attacked by a virus, They take a mug shot, just a tiny snippet of the genetic code of that virus, and they put it in these clustered repeated sequences in the bacteria's own genetic code. And so if it comes back, they got the mug shot, and they just take a guide RNA with an enzyme to chop it up. And that's all that CRISPR is. And this is why when we were talking about pure curiosity, there's in 1990, early 1990s, some graduate student on the coast of Spain at a university I'd never heard of kept seeing these repeated sequences in the bacteria from weird environments. And he thought, well, I've screwed this up. I'm supposed to know how to sequence things, but clearly I don't know what I'm doing because it keeps repeating. And then he realizes, okay, there is something called these. I mean, that these are real repeated sequences, and tries to figure out what they are. He names them CRISPR. And then he works with two guys at a yogurt company at Danisco, because they have all these bacteria cultures that they use for cheese and yogurt starters. And it's multi-billion-dollar industry. And what knocks it back is viruses kill the bacteria. So they're looking at all the historical sequences of bacteria, and they realize, oh, this is how these bacteria fought off viruses. Well, that's just done, first of all, out of pure curiosity, and then for a practical purpose, like helping make yogurt. And then when we get hit by viruses, you say, whoa, that pure curiosity of that Spanish graduate student, it actually led to something that's now worth understanding.
Mm. Did you study science, Walter? I mean, I'm just kind of amazed at your proficiency in all of these topics.
I got, when I was in middle school, on my bed, a copy of the double helix from my dad. Same thing as happened to Jennifer. I still have it. It's right over there. And it still has a pale red cover. It was the first edition that would actually be worth something, except for it has my sophomoric scribblings where I'm trying to define words I didn't understand, like biochemistry. And so I've always been fascinated by science. I'm not a professional scientist, which in some ways helps, meaning you have to explain it to me in words of one syllable so I can get it. And then I hope I can make it understandable in words of one syllable. One of the things I have against scientists is they're so totally brilliant, they don't spend a lot of time sharing it the way, a novelist or a musician would be quite happy to help, to open up about what they do, or for that matter, a lawyer or a doctor. But scientists sometimes make it more difficult. And so I love that role. My dad was an engineer, my brother's an engineer, my uncle, my grandfather. And so I grew up loving science and engineering. And even, I hate it when people say, well, I just can't do science, or I can't do math. We would think they were Philistines if they said, oh, I can't do poetry, or I can't do music, or I can't, do history. But, people seem willing to say, well, I can't do science. No, science is beautiful, and it's not any more complicated than history. Trust me. I try to understand history. That's hard.
Can you say a bit more too about Jennifer Doudna's partner, Emmanuel Charpentier, I believe, like the nature of that relationship and just a bit about her?
Yeah, they were scientific partners, and they complemented each other well. Different personalities, but also Emmanuel was good at microbes, small like bacteria and viruses. And Jennifer was a biochemist, good at chemistry and structural biology. And so when they combined their talents, it made for a great team. They met in Puerto Rico at a conference and took long walks on the cobblestone streets. And they said, hey, how about figuring out the components of CRISPR together? Because everybody had figured out that CRISPR existed, but they didn't know exactly what molecules make it work. So that's what they did, the two of them. But it was an interesting relationship that was very, very, tight intellectually, and then as friends, because Jennifer, as I said, had wanted to major in French for a while. So she calls Emmanuel Manu, they become friends. But Emmanuel, as you'll see in the book, and I went over to Berlin, where she now is, and just spent time with her. She's charmante. I speak French, but I never quite knew what charmante meant until I met her, which is this French charming style with a touch of aloofness to it, a touch of a Mona Lisa smile where you don't quite know what the charm is about. And they drift apart after they make this Nobel Prize winning discovery. And near the end of the book, you'll see I kind of get involved because Jennifer keeps asking me, what was it like being with her in Berlin? You know, I feel I've drifted away from her. Is she annoyed at me because I'm getting too much publicity, or what's the problem? And I asked Emmanuel, and it was, you know, I get the Mona Lisa smile. So finally I said, why don't we just, the three of us, get on Zoom together? And I'll ask you both those questions. And I don't want to spoil the end of the book, but there's a wonderful meeting. I finally turn off my video and just watch the two of them talk. But this happens in life. Just like you compete and just like you collaborate, you can have partnerships. By the way, I mean, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, I'm used to these complex partnerships. But I put this in the book because science is a personal endeavor. This is about real people. And so the bitterness towards the Broad Institute people and Fengjiang, the complex interactions with Emmanuel, and for that matter, the real complexities with James Watson, who has become racist and, you know, repugnant in many of his views, but is still the scientist who started this. I asked Jennifer to come with me, and we go to Cold Spring Harbor, where he sort of lives in exile because he's not allowed at meetings, and we go meet with him. So I want to get the complexity of human life. We're talking about 3 billion pairs of letters that make up our genome. That means we're complex as a species, real complex. And I want to convey that in the book as well.
That's beautiful. And there are a couple of really important questions here that I'm going to bring up. So, as a parent of a son with a serious, incurable, and fatal single gene disorder, I'm incredibly grateful for your work to shed light on what is likely to be a cure for him. While I understand the importance of establishing ethical guidelines, I'm curious for your take as a journalist on how we can ensure that society's dialogue around CRISPR always takes into account and emphasizes its most noble uses, as you have this evening.
Thank you. And that's why I did this evening, is because people like the questioner. This happens all the time. You get 4 questions about, aren't we snatching fire from the gods? Shouldn't we stop this? Isn't this going to be horrible? And then you have somebody whose kid may be saved because we now know how to fix single gene mutations. And I hope, you know, for your sake, I'm speaking to the questioner, I hope we can outrace this genetic problem, and it can work. And what I say to people, it's like people who become anti-science or afraid of science. I say, read this book and understand it and understand its potential. And I also push hard. They have these international conferences, and I'm at all these ethics panels. And it's got religious leaders, and it's got politicians, and I say, show me the victims. Bring in a kid that has a genetic disorder. Bring in a parent who has a child, because they get to be part of this discussion too. And so I've become a pretty fervent advocate of, let's not have this discussion without the parents and the kids who might be affected.
That's such an important point. The same person saying, I'm also wondering if you got a sense from Dr. Doudna of what the next frontier is for the application of CRISPR, and how quickly does she believe it will be widely available in the clinic for patients like my son?
Well, we have to make sure that we allow it to be available in the clinic, and that we don't have people slamming on the brakes like people try to do with GMOs or whatever, you know. So I think what Jennifer is working on is bringing down the cost of treatments like for sickle cell, which it's been used for already to cure, but it can cost $1 million. They're working on congenital blindness. They're working on cancer. And there are other people, not Jennifer, who I think will help this child more. David Liu is a superstar and a saint at Harvard. He's one of the people who can get along with Fengjiang and Eric Lander and Jennifer because he's so sweet. And he's taken CRISPR to the next step called base editing, which can change 1 letter at a time. I mean, it's like amazing. And with something called prime editing, which allows multiple genes to be changed in tandem. And so I think those will be, there are about 7,000 of these diseases that are simple genetic diseases, and we know how they could be fixed if we could do it in the clinic. And so I think, especially with prime editing, we're going to get there. And I look every month, I'll just look on the websites for clinical trials. Some of them set back a bit because of the pandemic. But I signed up for a vaccine clinical trial, and now I'm going to sign up for clinical trials. It's important we all do that.
Interesting. One thing that I'm just really thinking about in all of this is your, prediction that this next era is going to just be, even bigger than the information technology era that we've been through. And just the question of whether we're doing enough to prepare the next generation, and whether we're even seeing trends of, more and more, college age kids, for example, like getting into life sciences versus say computer sciences and such. Do you think we're doing enough, and what do we need to be thinking about? Again, going back to the education topic, to make sure that we have the brain power and the human power to actually pioneer that era.
Well, there's some good trends. Applications to medical school this year during the pandemic has gone up 18%. The number of people studying biology, undergraduates or graduate students, 60% are now women. So there's some good progress happening here. I do think in our schools, we have to teach curiosity about life. I think in some ways, this is going to sound a bit arrogant, but books like the one I wrote or that Jim Watson wrote or Horace Freeman Judson's book are better sometimes than the textbooks where you're supposed to memorize the periodic table. If I asked Jennifer, tell me the periodic table, she probably, couldn't do it any better than I can. But if you're part of an adventure story and you realize that this is a exciting detective story about understanding how life works, there's a joy in understanding how something works, especially when that something is ourselves. So I think we have to encourage, as we talk about STEM education, we have to encourage the notion of the beauty of nature as being the backbone of the curiosity that we want to keep nurturing in the kids.
Yeah. I really couldn't agree more. I actually think we should all be encouraging anyone who has teenage kids. I think if I'd gotten this book to one of my sons earlier on, it might have changed his.
He's a freshman. We still have a chance.
That's what I told him. He's listening to this book right now, Walter. It's not too late.
Text me his phone number.
Well, this has been such an amazing discussion. I can't imagine how many of these discussions you've had, Walter, but I'm just so grateful that you wrote the book. This is the best, by the way. And Wendy, you're still a teacher at heart. It's amazing. And we're still going at it.
I know. After all these years.
Yeah, no, totally. Paige, do you want to come back in? I don't know if you have other thoughts or questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to both of you so very much. And I loved, Wendy, hearing your perspective and your questioning line. I think this future generation, Walter, how they will carry the torch is something that is, as a mother, is, of great interest to me. And I think to a lot of people in this audience. So here's to hoping. If
we can just inspire. Now, and let me add one more thing. If we want to inspire our kids to learn and celebrate the beauty of nature and the secrets of life, our kids aren't going to be interested in anything unless we are. If we're interested in baseball, they're going to know every batting average of every catcher that ever played for the Dodgers. If we're interested in music, they're going to get into music. So I don't want this just to be a book you leave on the bed for your kids. I want people to read it first and to sort of share with people around them the fact that this is interesting to understand. It's important as we try to get vaccines, and it's also morally important as we as a society process this. Kids don't learn to love something if their parents aren't seeming to share that love. So I think we all should be, not just worrying about our kids. We should all try to say, I'm going to learn what a gene is. It's kind of fun to know that fact.
You're so right, Walter. And I said this to Walter earlier tonight, you all, when we were just getting on, but I honestly would never have probably prioritized this massive book. But I am so glad that the opportunity to have this conversation led me to do it. I feel so much more educated about what's going on in the world right now. And it's just it's so important. And you really did make topics that I would have thought were far out of reach. I know that you don't like to hear that, but like very much more accessible. So I highly recommend it to all the adults out there too, just to be clear, for sure.
Well, and as Wendy, you pointed out, the timing of this could not be more relevant. And frankly, it's become a conversation, maybe not directly, but that we are having in our household. And I know a lot of households. How did we get here? And, what does the future look like and how do we fix it? And this is a really, I know you didn't plan the timing, but to Wendy's point, it really couldn't have come out at a more perfect time to be having those discussions, because that's what people are talking about when I guess we're not going out to dinner, when they're, chatting on their Zooms if they have a few minutes, and some of us are going out to dinner if we live in warm climates. But this is incredibly relevant stuff. Yeah. So.
Thanks for having us, Paige.
Thank you to Wendy. Thank you to Walter. All of you, we have your copies at the bookstore of The Codebreaker. Unless you've asked us to ship, we will ship the final batch tomorrow. And be well, everyone. I hope you have a beautiful evening, and thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Walter.
Bye.